So the students really aren't getting any of the full picture of, saying, well, hey, there are, a lot of uncertainties about what we really believe here. And honestly, I think that's the same thing that's holding true for not just the theory of granite formation, but for the other classes that are being taught. Classes on, evolution, the different types of beliefs in evolution. Why do people believe in evolution? All of the uncertainties that are inherent in those theories aren't being fully disclosed to the students. It's being taught more as a fact. And behind all of these theories, of course, are serious flaws. And of course, behind our hypothesis, behind our belief is, of course, a belief that God is actually doing miraculous, He's doing miracles. So even that involves faith. But no matter whether you believe our conclusion about how the polonium halos exist, even if you don't accept our conclusion that they were created by God or they are evidence that God created the rock, you're still left with trying to explain them naturalistically. And that's the key to the whole situation. Even if you don't accept the conclusion of the polonium halos, you have to explain them naturalistically in your own model. And that's really what the problem is.
I'm tempted to go ahead. I'll say something just about on what you said just then. And that is the students who go into the classrooms and they listen. They're listening to people they think do what? Know the truth. And so they absorb what they hear as if it is the truth. Peer pressure.
Well, you're programmed when you go to school to believe that whatever's told from you from the up front is a fact. And 99% of the time, that's true. You go to elementary school, you hear about math, you hear about all the, history, all these things that are, verified, or you can attempt to verify them. Math is a logical thing. So you're used to hearing truth from a teacher. It's all turned around backwards when the teacher's actually trying to tell you something which has not been verified, but they don't disclose to the students that it hasn't been verified. They present it as fact. And that's the thing that it's really dangerous, especially the younger the students are, the less they're able to make up their own minds about what they believe, the more danger it is.
David, we've got what the geologists really calculate. In other words, we mentioned, of course, deep in the ground and so forth. They believe that the millions of years it took, of course, for the melt to become solid and so forth. But that means also there was what we call differential melting from the outside in. And so a small piece of melt then should be able to be solidified.
Right. So the argument that says, well, you can't devise an experiment to actually test the theory of formation of granite because you don't have the millions of years. But if you use the principle of differential cooling, you actually do have time to do that type of an experiment. In fact, it only takes a few days or a few weeks at the most. This theory of rapid cooling and formation of a small quantity of granite melt was disproved during the University of Tennessee public presentation on April 13, 1987.
Here we come to what I think is an exciting part of our presentation. Years ago, 1987, as David was saying, April 13, 1987, yours truly was invited to make a presentation on this topic at the University of Tennessee. And here's a view, at least of the audience, that particular evening. A lot of people from the Knoxville area came, as well as students, as well as faculty members. And here's the title, Should Creation Science Be Taught at the University of Tennessee? Well, that grabbed some headlines there at the university and got some faculty members all excited about coming in and defending, of course, the university from the teaching of creation science. And it was Monday, April 13, 1987, the UT Alumni Gym, sponsored by the UT chapter of the Society for Creation Science, a chapter that I did not know anything about before they contacted me and asked me if I would make the presentation. I was the guest speaker that night, and there I am speaking. A little bit younger than I am tonight. But in any event, what I was saying at that particular time was what David and I have just been talking about. David can affirm, we've got a videotape of this, it'll be available tomorrow night for anyone who wants it. But David can affirm that indeed I was up there telling the audience, that here I've just got a small piece of granite. Supposedly this would form relatively soon if you tried to duplicate it. And so at that particular time, we had a little piece of granite like this I had in my hand, and I was telling the audience, the thing that's wrong with evolution theory of granite formation is that you can't even duplicate something like this in the laboratory. And I said, that proves in itself the whole idea of granite formation is wrong, doesn't come out to be granite at all. And then I next remarked that to produce polonium halos in granite, in other words, if you're going to try to explain these primordial polonium halos naturalistically, that means you've got to be able to duplicate them in the granite rock itself. I was telling them about that. Then I said, the very fact, though, that geologists, no one can actually synthesize a small piece of granite. In other words, if you melt it and then let it cool under pressure and temperature and conditions and so forth, that it doesn't really come back to that. That was what I was saying to the audience at that particular time. And at that particular time, I had, as I said, a piece of granite in my hand, and this geology professor speaks out from the audience, said, "You don't know what you're talking about. You don't know what you're talking about." And at that point in time, he had a number of geology students there. Do you remember what happened?
They were cheering.
Yeah.
As when he got up, and when the professor stood up in the back of the audience, and he said, "I'm going to take exception to this," and he comes down, and his students were back there clapping and cheering, and there was a real air of victory that was about to happen, because the professor of geology was going to come up and say, basically he stood up there and he said, "I don't know what you're talking about when you say you can't synthesize a piece of granite. I do it all the time in my laboratory. I do it, I can do, it happens all the time." But then when he was questioned a little more closely about it, and just for your own FYI here, the full videotape of his talk or his discourse there, or the whole presentation is available still. Unfortunately, the video quality isn't as good as it could have been, but you can still get an idea of the tension that was there that night, because at first, everybody's like really surprised that somebody stood up and challenged, but then, by the time, he stood up and was making these comments, it was apparent that he really believed in what he was saying.
It was a real first-class confrontation. He was right back there, about the end of the auditorium here, and I couldn't hear him. And I said, "Well, come on up to the microphone." And that's what he's done. He's come up to the microphone there. And he said, "What do you mean you can't synthesize granite? What do you mean? There are hundreds of reports in the literature. You're just ignorant. You're ignorant of all these reports. Where have you been?" type stuff. And so I said, "Well, let me hear what you have to say." And so the more he talked, "Yeah." And I said, "Do you think you can synthesize a piece of granite?" "Yeah." I said, "How long will it take you?" Well, and I had a piece of granite, a small piece of granite in my hand. I said, "Well, come, take a look at this piece." And I walked over to the edge of the stage, and I said, "Come, take a look at it." And so he walked over and looked at it for half a minute or so and gave it back to me. And I said, "How long do you think it will take you to do that?" "About a week." "About a week." Dave was smiling. He heard him say it. And so I said, "Can we all come back and see it? Can we all come back and see it in a week?"
And he said, no. He goes, my laboratory's not set up to do that. He goes, "But we can go down to Johnson Space Center," or where else did he say? Anyway, it doesn't matter what he said. You can look at the video, but one of them was Johnson Space Center. I just remember that for some reason. And I just thought, why would you go to Johnson Space Center? But anyway, it was good. It was a good illustration of the prevailing scientific belief that, there is really no controversy about the granite formation, and that you really can synthesize a hand-sized piece of granite. But when you really look into the details, it's a lot harder, it's a lot easier said than done. You can't really synthesize the granite. And the implications of that are important.
Well, as we continued, my interchange with the professor here went on for 23 minutes all in all, and again, it's all on the videotape. It's available tomorrow night if you're interested. It's online at www.halos. You don't have to buy anything, and it's all there. But as we progressed, I progressed in discussing this with him. He continued to be affirming that hundreds of reports were in the literature, and I was just ignorant for not knowing about how many times granite had been synthesized, plus the fact that he continued to affirm that indeed he could do it. And so anyway, the issue was joined, so to speak, And finally, I said, you know, we need to, I said, if you can do it, I'll give you my telephone number and I'll ask you to call me. And I said, we'll make this not only a citywide, county-wide announcement, we'll make it statewide, we'll make it national television that you, Professor Taylor, have been able to actually synthesize a piece of granite here at the University of Tennessee. Now, at this particular point in time, the applause of the students had gone down a little bit. But I mean, as David said earlier, they were a cheering section. They had planned it, apparently, for him to say something. It was a cheering section for a while. Anyway, the program ended that night. Before that particular program that night, earlier we said, last night, of course, that the National Academy of Sciences, this most eminent of all scientific organizations in the world, had put out a booklet in 1984, and they had said that essentially Genesis had been what?
Invalidated.
Invalidated. There was nothing to Genesis. And so I wrote a letter to the president of the National Academy of Sciences before our meeting that night and asking him to come and send members of the National Academy of Sciences and show where this evidence was going to be refuted, because it had all been published in the national journals. Anyway, he didn't come, but he wrote a letter, and that letter is a copy of that letter is in the back of my book, if you want to look at it that way. It's all online, halos.com. But anyway, the president, Dr. Frank Press, said, we recognize essentially that you have scientific reports, and these need to be discussed. But in essence, you know, I'm not going to come, I'm not going to send anybody to be with you. We can't agree that one small piece of data, small piece of data, is going to overthrow all the fields of geology, astronomy, biology. It just went on and on and on. And as you have pointed out last night, earlier, that indeed this one little tiny piece of data, though, is what? Worldwide. And it's something where indeed the geologists, the evolutionists of the world, simply want to ignore. They want to bury. Usually when you find something unusual that contrasts or contradicts a known physical theory, scientific theory of any report, the scientists of the world would bring that to the center of scientific attention for analysis, for investigation, to find out what the truth is. But David, what has happened in this case?
Well, we're still going to find out.
We're still going to find. Thus far, they're trying to bury it. Well, anyway, he said he could make granite in a week. Nothing happened. In a week, nothing. 6 months later, nothing happened. I wrote to the geology department chairman, and I said, you know, Dr. Taylor has said he promised he would give me a piece of granite in a week, or at least would provide me with one of these hundreds of reports on granite synthesis, but there was no reply. 22 years and more now tonight, there's still no granite synthesis. And so after he spoke, after that 23-minute exchange, I said, well, listen, you know, there's something really important. I'm so happy you came forward tonight, because here's the situation. Geologists have claimed that indeed they have synthesized granite in the laboratory. That was a claim. Someone had indicated that to me many, many times. And so I investigated that claim. It was something that was done at the University of Pennsylvania way back in the 1960s, and a geologist there had actually taken a small piece of granite and put it in a platinum envelope and sealed it up, heated it up to 900 degrees centigrade, and then let it cool very, very, very slowly over several weeks. Now, those are the exact conditions you expect to have granite form experimentally. Well, it turns out that he had all that photographed. In other words, there was a motion picture made of this experiment in University of Pennsylvania way back in the 1960s. And then there was a time where indeed the experiment was over, and the platinum envelope was opened, and the piece of rock came out. Now, I, through God's great providence, was able to track down that particular piece of rock. Decades earlier, the geologists who had done it, by my request, went back, and my belief is that the Lord helped him to find that piece of rock, and he sent it to me. Well, I had it that night at the University of Tennessee, and I contrasted. Here's what happens in the earth. There's a granite melt in the earth, and sometimes it will protrude to the surface in a tube. And so a core then was taken of a granite melt that had solidified 1,683 feet below the surface, and indeed it was taken out. The core sample was there, and granite melted deep in the earth solidifies to rhyolite. Now that rhyolite has the same chemical elements as the original granite, but it does not have the texture, in other words, the large minerals. And it doesn't have the halos. This is what resulted from the actual experiment to try to synthesize granite.